I am Dracula. I bid you welcome.
This Halloween, you won't like me when I'm angry.
The Bloodstone.
Papa.
I bid you welcome.
For as long as I could remember, and I do mean quite literally my entire life, Swan Lake was always the opener for October 1st. Horror movies are a major part of my life, and I owe a lot of that to the Universal classics. I realize that these probably aren't as popular with the kids these days. Hell, they aren't really that popular with people my own age, or even that much older, really. I realize some people just don't care much for the old stuff, and how the fact that a film over 90 years old are still able to be watched on a 4K disc isn't exciting to someone, I'll never understand. I want to say that while I have so much respect for these movies, that they haven't aged well, but they gave us a great start. But I can't, because that's a lie. These films are still good today. The Universal Classics refers to an era, typically the 1930s through 40s, that include a series of horror films that did in fact set the modern groundwork. Of course, horror goes even further back. I've described some of the earlier works before, but even then, the concept of the horror film just wasn't seen as such yet. Traditionally, we say that Dracula is the start, which I somewhat disagree with. I would like to give that acknowledgement to earlier Universal classics like Phantom of the Opera or Hunchback. Although Dracula did have a major difference, that is what makes it the starting point.
I am Dracula.
It was a talkie. The idea of films with their own sound was very new technology. Sound came about the end of the 1920s, and it was very expensive. Many of the theaters weren't even equipped to play sound for film yet. The early Universal films were intended to adapt famous horror texts and bring them to screen. Dracula and Frankenstein were the obvious choices. In my previous video, I talked about the original Dracula adaptation, Nosferatu, which was made without legal consent. Carl Laemmle Jr., on the other hand, son of the founder of Universal Pictures, also saw the potential of a box office hit with the chilling novel. Now, in this era of sound and advanced cinematography, over the 10 years from Nosferatu, surely this young filmmaker and producer believed that they could make the horror film. And Universal paid a decent amount of money to get the exclusive rights to the character. And to this day, they still hold a death grip to their likeness of these monsters. You'll see a multitude of different movies from different studios using these monsters, but these specific images of them belong to Universal. They hired Pulitzer Prize winner Louis Bromfield to write the script. His initial vision was close to the novel while connecting to the already successful stage play. In comparison to Nosferatu, this would be far closer to the original vision of Dracula. Bromfield's original concept included having Harker travel to Transylvania like the novel, and Dracula being an old guy who grows younger in appearance as he feeds. These ideas were ultimately scrapped for unsure reasons. We can assume that it was either censorship or cost. Because of this, Bromfield was actually replaced with Garrett Ford, who took most of the stage play and put it into the film screenplay. He also took careful consideration of Nosferatu. That included adding this scene, which was actually from Nosferatu originally and not from the novel. Even with a solid script, a major hurdle still existed. Who to play the title role? Two major actors were considered. Conrad Veidt, known for The Man Who Laughs. Unfortunately, his English was not adept enough for the role, leading them to Lon Chaney, the man himself, the man of 1,000 faces, already a true icon. Unfortunately, Chaney died of lung cancer aggravated from fake snow shoved down his throat from another film. Laemmle was incredibly picky. This was Dracula after all. It had to be a new icon, something that will leave a legacy, that would define the image of the character for decades to come, nearly a century now. Lugosi was not his pick. He in fact didn't really want Lugosi. He had already had some acting experience prior, but it was amplified when the role of Dracula fell onto him. That was the stage play of Dracula. There's actually a famous myth that Lugosi learned English for the role. That's not true. He already knew English pretty well. He did still have that thick Hungarian accent, though, which just so happened to help make him perfect for the role. Lugosi loved Dracula. It was the role he felt was made for him. He knew that no matter what, however high or low his career got, and damn, it got low, he knew he is Dracula. But he had to fight to get that role. He fought tooth and nail, and even with being the title role, he accepted a smaller salary. That sacrifice earned him the role. Filming began in late 1930, and apparently was not a great time. It was recorded to be a highly disorganized event. The director, Todd Browning, apparently left much of the actual direction to cinematographer Karl Freund, who had actually worked with Murnau, the director of Nosferatu. He also, interestingly enough, worked on Metropolis and I Love Lucy. In fact, this guy is the reason for flat lighting used on multi-camera systems for sitcom. Lugosi was described as rather self-absorbed, but not rude. If anything, he was more distant. He didn't communicate with the other cast or crew outside of formalities, which even some actors can't accomplish that. He was so into himself as Dracula, just constantly falling in love with his image and the look. He was joined by another actor from the stage play, Edward Van Sloan, who played Van Helsing, appropriately named. Van Sloan apparently hated this movie. The same could be said for the leading lady, Helen Chandler, as Mina, who was the highest paid actor on the film. She detested the story and how the audience perceived her after it. She was also drunk half the time on set. Dracula necessarily isn't a scarier movie than Nosferatu, but it does have a major advantage. Now we can hear the voice associated with the monster, and it's articulate, clean, sophisticated, iconic. The terror of Dracula over Orlok is his charisma. He does not have to lurk, he can be present, he can conversate. That is his strength. He arouses the attention of others with his manners and unique accent, like a spider trapping an insect in its web. Dracula has since been done hundreds of times on screen, but this was still the first major book adaptation, the first real attempt to bring Dracula to screen for wider audiences. For us now, it's a familiar story. Even those who have never seen the film know of it. The first woman to speak here, the first voice of horror, is Carla Laemmle, niece of Carl Laemmle.
Nosferatu!
Nosferatu mentioned. The opening of the film is pretty close to the novel, starting with Harker's journey to Dracula's castle, except for one major difference. This isn't Harker. This is Renfield. They chose to simplify the character by also making him more intimately connected with the main story. As Dracula, the novel has quite a bit of stories, branching narratives that are streamlined and condensed in this film. It only takes 6 minutes to finally see the man himself, but they still use all that time to build up to him. To build up everyone's anxiety over this demon that they fear so greatly. One who kills innocents, feeds on babies. And here he is. A guy. Eccentric, sure, but definitely not terrifying in appearance as one would expect. That ought to soothe the anxieties a person may have upon meeting him. Dracula's brides are also mentioned, but they aren't really used much in the film. But ultimately this was the 1930s, a very wholesome time, and Dracula's brides are very sexual in nature, more like a succubus. They're very promiscuous, even attacking poor Harker with their features.
My God! What are you doing to the furniture?
Letting his guard down, then going in for a bite. Their presence in this film is more ghostly, and they don't really add much to the story. It does alleviate some of the loneliness of Drac's time here, though. Although Dracula himself is a lonely guy. He can't even eat but prepares a meal for his guest, and he's got to do all the chores himself, which he seems to be lacking on. And worst of all, he has to pretend like he's a human. But given how long it's been since he's had interactions like these, he comes off as odd. He talks strange, and his mannerisms are bizarre. No wonder poor guy wanted to make an army of the undead. He just needs some people to chill out with. The cinematography for Transylvania is awe-inspiring. Unlike the on-location shooting of Nosferatu, this was all done on sets, which is pretty obvious, but it still looks so good. It's really setting in that gothic image for these films. Foggy sets just look so glamorous in black and white. That said, on a technical level, the cinematography here is pretty stiff, probably due to all the arguing going on behind the scenes. When we look at the Spanish release, that I'll talk more about towards the end of the video, you'll see just what I mean. Just so you know, they had to shine a light in Lugosi's eyes to make that glowing effect, and it hurt like a bitch. It's incredible how much audio can add to a scene. The pacing here is so much more intense than that with Nosferatu. Dracula playing the silent cab driver against Renfield's questioning. He watches him as he goes to the carriage, and it really makes the silence stronger when it's going against sound.
Listen to them. Children of the night. What music they make.
Dracula doesn't say this line until well later in the book, and it doesn't stand out as much unless you consider how iconic Lugosi made it. It's a good line, but when Lugosi says it, it's history. Some of the stuff is kinda kooky, like the film's attempt of having Dracula walk through the web by simply just not showing us the action, but we assume that's what happens due to the way that it's cut. Dracula's reaction here is also bizarre. He's not necessarily rushing Renfield, nor does he seem to be judging him. More so, he's just waiting for the bug to go into his web. There are so many nice details in the castle. Look at that, there's a dead tree going through the window. I just love how exaggeratedly big the sets are, to give us that impression of how this is a large castle. Really, these guys would be echoing like crazy talking in here. This is a sequence borrowed from Nosferatu. Just look how different they are in presentation though. Dracula is able to recompose himself and pretend to be human again. Orlok, not so much. We can see more instances of censorship here. Renfield is knocked out by a bat, or fainted by a bat, and then the brides make their approach. Again, very devoid of their sexually predatory nature, to just kind of being there. Dracula, in essence, is a very erotic story, horror with strong sexual overtones. The film is probably the most repressed in that regard. A lot of the sexual aspects are greatly downplayed, but traces of it still exist. Anyway, we skip a whole chunk of the story, literally only showing one night of Renfield's stay, to go to the Demeter section, and they don't actually call it the Demeter in this, they call it something else. And then there were some intertiles here to help move the story along, and given that this is still an early talkie, it's expected that some of those elements from silent films would still be used here. We can also just note that this in general is a very quiet film. Even though it's a talkie, there are so many moments of just silence. Full film scores weren't really a thing yet, so we had pieces of music, but it's mostly the sounds of the set and the actors that we get. And given that this movie wants a lot of dramatic effect, it's pretty damn quiet. You'll definitely hear someone opening up their box of candy during this one. For a not so quiet sequence, the Demeter's footage is actually from another movie, ironically a silent film called The Stormbreaker. Foley artists added in sound effects, and the footage was sped up to match Dracula's frame rate, which still doesn't match too well with the added in sequences with Ren and Drac. And I love Drac watching the crew struggle to keep the ship afloat. Like the process of eating them all is going to be far more taxing because of the chaos. That said, we don't really see much of what happens here, but it actually plays out like the book. The whole event is pretty ambiguous. But in the novel, we learn pieces of the captain's diary, as well as the reports upon the ship's arrival. The film kinda does that. It helps that the censorship leaves more of the violent aspects to our imagination. Renfield, on the other hand, isn't so lucky, and in this version, that's how he gets locked up. Oh me, oh my. Many of the characters from the novel have been removed or switched around for fluidity of the story, keeping our focus on Mina, Lucy, and Harker here. Condensed as it may be, the beats all play out like you would expect. Drax somehow seduces Lucy, doing his business, this time without the werewolf sex. There's no way we weren't supposed to get a kick out of this.
No, Martin! Martin, don't throw my splatter away from me! Oh, Martin, no.
Aren't you ashamed now?
People make fun of Lugosi for how into the role he was, but look at Van Sloan. It's like the lights are on, but nobody's home. In a lot of these classics, you see actors incorporate stage skills onto film because it was treated pretty similarly. And given that talkies were still new, and Sloan had made pretty obvious statements of not really understanding just what the camera can actually do over what actors have to exaggerate or make up for on the stage. It's very theatrical in most cases, and that's splendid. It works so well in Renfield's case. He comes off more unhinged and unsettling. It works so well for that character. He's gonna say it. He's gonna say it.
Dracula! I never even heard the name before.
I'm sure all that alcoholism helped put some glaze on those eyes for this hypnotic performance. One of the best parts of the film is when Drac and Helsing are measuring each other up. The lack of the score adds to the overall tension of the scene alongside the masterclass of both of these actors' skills. Although Van Sloan struggled to understand why they would use such a little mirror here instead of a grand one like they would in a stage play. Well, there you go, buddy. That's the power of the camera. God, the amount of emotions that Drac conveys here just has such a rhythm to it. A modern film would scream an intense score at you and probably use 3 or 4 different angles for reaction shots. I personally find long takes or oneers to be more impressive. I get so much anxiety watching them just because of how intense the choreography of the scene can be. I'm surprised the film actually discussed the child murders as much as it did. The vampire Lucy is tricking kids and attacking them for blood. I would have thought she would have killed the kids while eating or draining them, but apparently they lived long enough for this newspaper exposition. Of course, because of censorship, we don't really get a proper resolution to this. It takes Lucy's vampiric turn that really forces the men to believe in Van Helsing after they witness her eating a kid and are forced to put her down. Could you imagine seeing that in 1931? People fainted when Boris Karloff came on the screen as Frankie for the first time. They'd shat their pants. Well, at least we got this instead.
Rats.
Say what you will about this movie, it has a lot of comedy in it. And I think the Universal films really excelled at knowing how to balance comedy with horror.
Nuts in May, nuts in May, nuts in May. Here we go gathering nuts in May on a cold and frosty morning.
The rest of the film hyperspeeds through the story, going to the climactic finale. Although the battle happens in Carfax, as they don't actually have time to go all the way back to Transylvania. Renfield's death is actually pretty haunting, and the screams are at least. They actually removed this in some versions because they thought it was too graphic. And Drac's death is actually pretty graphic given the time too. In the novel, he's stabbed by the gang. Here, Helsing impales him with a stake. It happens off-screen, but the sound design makes it pretty graphic. You would have thought they would have gone for the Nosferatu route for censorship, but no. Dracula really just is the granddaddy of horror. It's not the most technically impressive, it's not even really scary for modern viewers, but it does master the art of atmosphere with a constant chilling force creeping down your spine. Most of the time, masterful acting, and really just the ambition. Ambition that started a whole new wave. There have been horror films before, but this started the trope. This really accumulated all of the predecessors' work with newfound technology and molded it into something that was easy for all audiences to get into. It wasn't overwhelmingly shocking with its subject matter, nor was it visually assaulting the audience. It is undoubtedly one of the most important movies ever made, and for the younger viewers out there, I promise you it's still entertaining. Sit down and watch it in a late night with a bowl of popcorn, and I promise you'll have a good time. Before signing off, I do want to acknowledge the Spanish version. Since talkies were new, dubs weren't really a thing, so Universal let another crew and cast film a Spanish version for Dracula using the same sets and equipment. It would be shot on the same day as the English version at different time. I can only imagine how stressful that must have been with scheduling. And actually, It's superior than the original in some regards. Seriously, look at the comparison of the camera work here. It's also not as filtered or censored with the graphic or sexual aspects of the story. Definitely worth the watch, especially if you're a fan of the original and haven't seen it before. Well, that's all I got to say about Dracula. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, and if you haven't already, please subscribe as it really helps my channel out a lot. Thanks for watching, and as always, I'll see you next time.